In this video about workflow, we are going to discuss the workflow list and the workflow overview page. So to begin, we are going to go to the main menu, down to Manage Setup, down to Workflow Notifications, and then the Workflow Manager. Keep in mind that your main menu may look different than mine, depending on the version of the system that you're on. More or less, though, you're looking for the Workflow Manager under Manage Setup. Now here's the Workflow List Manager. This will contain all of the workflow that you have in your system. Depending on when you signed with Cobblestone, you may see some out-of-the-box workflow, or you may not. It depends. Either way, for these videos, we are going to talk about how to create new workflow. Either way, in these workflow videos, we are going to talk about a workflow process that I have set up in my system that you won't see out of the box. This list is simply alphabetized, right? And if you need to, you can filter and sort through the list. So if I want to find the process that I showed in the previous video, I could maybe type in the word consulting or something like that, click contains, and it'll filter me down to the workflow processes where the name contains the word consulting. And you can, of course, filter by other fields in these columns as well. We also have folders on the left-hand side. The folders I have here don't come out of the box. I set those up myself, but you can organize your workflow processes by folder. Just click the plus icon to make a new folder, choose the workflow steps, and then drag and drop them into the folder. If you don't organize them by folder, the list is, again, simply just alphabetized, and I like to filter to find the workflow steps I'm looking for. It's also good to acknowledge that each step here is built individually and independently. So even though these consulting agreement approval steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, are a part of the same approval process, so to speak, they are technically speaking separate workflow steps. So each workflow step is separate, and then we often combine them, make them interdependent to make a workflow process. But strictly speaking, these are individual workflow steps, okay? And there's some settings between steps like 1 and 2, for example, that will cause the completion of step 1 to trigger the initiation of step 2. Okay, so these are separate. If I wanted to add a step 5 here, I would go to the side menu and then click Add New Workflow. Now, I'm going to make a brand new workflow process. So I'm going to go to the side menu and click Add New Workflow. Of course, if you wanted to edit an existing process, click View Edit. It's really largely the same thing, but for sake of this training video, we're going to add something new. Now, this is effectively the overview page for the workflow, and it looks a bit more complicated than it is. There's really only 4 fields here you really need to know, and that I'll be covering in this video. So first, choose the area of the system that the workflow will apply. So choose the primary table that you want to use the workflow. So if it's a contract-based workflow, which this one will be, choose contract details. If it's a request workflow, choose contract requests. If it's a counterparty workflow, choose vendors, customers, choose the appropriate table of the system, right? We're not going to go through all of them, but usually just choose the primary table. Then the workflow name. I usually recommend using a good naming convention here. If you don't, that workflow list I showed a moment ago can get pretty messy. So my personal preference is to give this like a process name first. Maybe this will be like my NDA approval process, right? In my system, I largely build my workflow processes around the contract types. So I'll continue that trend here. So this will be my NDA approval process, and then I'll give it a number so they're organized in the right order. And then I'll give this a friendly name. I'll call this prepare for review. I also see folks do the number and then the process name and then the friendly name, or do whatever works for you, really. As long as you're consistent, you'll be fine. Then I'll set this to active. I do want to use this workflow pretty much immediately, so I'm going to set this to active. Of course, if you want to retire the workflow, set this to no. And then run job on update. Long story short, put run job on update to yes. We put this to yes most of the time. To give more of a background for this field, if you don't put this to yes, the workflow can only fire when you add the record to the system, right? But if you put this to yes, the workflow, the job, can run on an update, meaning when you edit a record. So basically, if I put this to yes, this would allow the workflow to fire when I add contracts to the system and also when I edit contracts. So if you envision this, if you add a contract to the system, it might not necessarily trigger the conditions for this workflow that we'll set up in a moment. But then someone goes in and edits the fields of that contract. Now the conditions are met. But if I put this to yes, the editing would trigger an update and this workflow would be able to fire. So again, long story short, put this to yes, that's the background. But if you put this to yes, 99% of the time, that would be correct. So we'll go with that. All right, and here's basically the overview. I'll just scroll down now and click Save and Continue. Then these tabs are going to appear. I have name and options. That's what the tab is called. Of course, I can go back and edit these fields if I need to. But now we're going to move over to Conditions. And in the next video, we're going to pick up on this Conditions tab. Thank you.